See the light?
Yeah,
It's going.
it's focusing too.
Yeah, it's autofocus.
And of course, we just all
Yeah.
Right up here.
Okay, we're all set to go.
Well, I was busy all day too.
Your friends in the gallery.
You tried running off.
I have to be able to do my work.
Debbie Trotter will present our program, How Grundy County Got Its Name. She will trace the early history in the settling of the county. She has been working at our Morris Public Library for 14 years. I see her 2 or 3 times a week. She came here from Newport Beach, California, and during the bicentennial to organize the library's local history collection. She received her degree in English from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and her master's degree in library science from USC. So I think it's just great that we're going to have her speak to us tonight.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah. This is the February 27th meeting of the Grundy County Historical Society. Debbie Trotter Steffes will speak on names in Grundy County.
Thank you, Helen. You know, Reverend Shea really sort of introduced my topic when he said that history and geography go hand in hand. Now, I'm sure a lot of you grew up listening to Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. And so you know how the camel got its hump and how the whale got its throat, and maybe even how the leopard got its stripes. But maybe you don't know how Grundy County got its various names. Well, there's a science to place names, and it's called toponymy. And it's just based mainly on the different immigration patterns that took place here in the United States. Each area of the country has different place names based on the way people moved into an area. Now, there's a fellow named Ronald Baker who's an expert on Indiana place names, and he's come up with 13 different sources of how places were named here in the United States. And 10 of these sources apply right here to Grundy County. First of all, places are named after people. I'd guess that about 95% of all the places here in Grundy County are named after people. Roads and creeks, as you know, were named after early settlers that owned the land. Secondly, places are named after other places, either from places back east, like Saratoga or Ariana, or for places further back to Europe, like Vienna and Verona. Names are based on direction, like South Wilmington or Depot Street, the street near the depot. Names can be descriptive. We have Goose Lake and Jug Handle Road. And Indian names, of course, are very popular. We have a lot of them here in Grundy County, like Manuka, Wopacan, Mazan, and so on. And there is one place in Grundy County that comes from another language, Ausable. Some places have been coined. Helen Ulrich coined Southmore Road to indicate the first road south of Morris. Out west you hear of places that have stories or legends that go behind them. We have one out here in Coal City. It's the corner of Broadway and Main. It was once called the Queen's Corner. Now, Constance Piano was a miner's widow. Her husband was killed in a mine accident, and so in order to keep body and soul together, she operated a general store. And whenever the miners went on strike, why, she would extend credit to the miners since they couldn't use the company store. So she was so well beloved by everyone in Little Pioneer Coal City that the people called her the Queen. Hence, her store was the Queen's Corner. Sometimes places are backed with a sense of humor. Now, I'm not sure on this, but I think maybe Godly is one of these. It certainly has a reputation as being very ungodly. Finally, places are named after an incident or an event that happened there. Now, Pioneer Road out in Nettle Creek Township commemorates the site of the first pioneer settlement that happened in Grundy County. So by looking at the sources of various place names, you get a pretty good idea of how places were named. Now let's see if we can figure out why. Why, for instance, was Grundy County named after a lawyer who never even set foot here? Well, it was a matter of timing, and Felix Grundy happened to be the hero of the hour. Now, Grundy County was carved out of LaSalle County in February of 1841. Felix Grundy died on December 19th, 1940, just two months previous. So this fellow was so charismatic, and his death was fresh in the mind of Americans in general, that the early people of Grundy County decided to name their new county after him. Well, this wasn't exactly a unique idea. There are also 3 other counties in the United States named after him. There's one in Iowa, Missouri, and of course in Tennessee. Now, the early settlers here were so enamored of him that they also used his first name for Felix Township south of the river. Well, why was he so special? I think in order to get a grip on this, you have to think like a pioneer. Now, throughout his political career, Felix Grundy was closely associated with Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party. Now, the first party in Grundy County was Democratic. I don't think the Republican Party came along until Lyman B. Ray sort of got it rolling. So the early settlers here were Democrats. Felix Grundy was a Democrat. Also, during the War of 1812, Felix Grundy was beginning his 6-year term in the United States Senate. And on the Senate floor, he campaigned in favor of U.S. involvement in this war that was mainly involved in keeping the Indians. The British were fueling the Indian hostilities against the early white settlers. And the Americans were trying to do something about squelching some of this. Also, when Felix Grundy served as Attorney General under President Van Buren, he opposed the chartering of a national bank. This was sort of a snooty idea because people in favor of this bank worked by their wits rather than their labor. Pioneers, of course, were laborers. But above all, Felix Grundy was in favor of granting preemption rights to the early settlers who could claim a piece of land by just moving in, settling on it, and making improvements. And also he favored the reduction of prices of public lands. But Felix Grundy's real claim to fame was as a frontier lawyer. In the frontier days when people shot first and then fought afterwards. And Grundy himself was basically a backwoodsman. He wasn't highly educated, but he was very intelligent. And he had developed his ability at criminal law by studying men rather than books. And he could judge men very accurately. He had a pleasing personality, and his great ability won people's confidence. He knew men's emotions, and he knew how to direct them. He could turn a plaintiff into either a hero or a scoundrel. He cultivated his voice. He practiced so that he could make his voice soft, persuasive, incisive, and just completely irresistible. So, needless to say, a frontier jury, emotional, uneducated, they just became putty in his hands. Now, Grundy's knowledge of human nature also made him very good at picking out a jury. Anybody that couldn't be swayed by emotional appeal was just passed over. And during the trial itself, Grundy took only a few notes on the key points. And when all the proofs were in, he could intuitively see what was most important in this case. Then he'd concentrate on these points and just disregard any extemporaneous stuff. Then, when the court adjourned for the day, Felix Grundy was one of the first men to leave the room. And from then until dinner time, he just socialized with people around him. He loved a good joke, he was a good listener, he was a good talker. If there ever was a hearty burst of laughter in the room, you could bet it came from Felix Grundy. But to the casual observer, this lawyer for the defense didn't seem to be paying too much attention to the trial. He was kind of sandbagging it, as we used to call it in college. But then, after dinner, Felix Grundy would withdraw to his room. And he usually went to bed very early, and he fell asleep immediately. But then, at 1 in the morning, he'd get up, and from then until dawn, he'd work on preparing his speech for the jury the next day. And since Grundy could deliver his speeches without many notes, very casually, very offhand, people thought that he didn't spend much time preparing his speeches. But they were wrong, because he spent at least 1 or 2 of these early pre-dawn sessions preparing his speech for the jury. He'd studied every aspect of the trial so that he completely understood it, so that he wouldn't omit a single piece of evidence or a single piece of ground that he wanted to cover that would help him in his defense. And then once he had all his facts carefully in his mind, he'd embellish on them. Every part of the case became a part of him. Then, when he appeared before the jury, Grundy would look it over and select one man to whom he'd direct a very passionate appeal. That way, if he couldn't sway the whole group, at least he could be sure of a hung jury. And Grundy was always very courteous to the opposition. He was never boisterous. He often used humor and sarcasm. And Grundy, for the defense, was totally awesome. One contemporary claimed that he'd seen huge assemblies in the courtroom, quote, tremble and shudder, the judge on the bench forget his position and loll out his tongue and clap his hands for joy, and the refined and enlightened spectators in the galleries faint and weep in an excess of feeling, completely overcome by the eloquence of Felix Grundy. Well, out of the 165 capital cases that Felix Grundy was called upon to defend, there was only one execution that took place. And a Bennett case became a current catchphrase for any totally hopeless cause. And that is the man that Grundy County was named after. Well, what about the county seat? It too was named after a hero, the local people at least. His name was Isaac Morris. Now this tale hinges on the network of legal stipulations that were set forth by the Illinois state legislation that created Grundy County. Grundy County bill stated that it was the responsibility of the Illinois-Michigan Canal Commissioners to find a seat of justice for the newly established county. Also, this county seat had to be located on canal land, somewhere along the line of the I&M. Well, that left only 2 possible locations. One was a little village called Clarkson, which is out in Ariana Township, just west of Mount Carmel Cemetery. And the other place was in Section 9. You know where that is, foot of Liberty Street, southwest corner, Main and Liberty. Well, the canal commissioners were in favor of the Clarkson site because they figured that the adjacent canal lands would go up in value and net more money for the canal. But the majority of the early settlers here in our little town were in favor of the Section 9 site, but they didn't have any vote in the issue. So there was a deadlock. And for almost a year, all of the county business was carried out in a little log cabin at the foot of Liberty Street. The mailing address for this temporary county seat was Grundyville. Finally, in the spring of 1842, the term of one of the canal commissioners expired and he had to be replaced by an outsider, a fellow from Quincy, Illinois. That was Isaac Morris. Well, another conference to figure out where this new county seat was going to be located was pending. So Isaac Morris sallied forth and he inspected these two possible locations. He looked over the village of Clarkston and he pondered over Grundyville. Not only that, he discussed the two possible locations with the county officers and with the people that lived here. And after much research, Isaac Morris decided to cast his vote in favor of the location where the actual settlers of Grundyville wanted it. Well, the town people were so delighted with this manly and independent decision on the point of Isaac Morris that they decided to name their new county seat after him. Grundyville became Morristown. Well, here we have a problem, because there's also another place in Morristown, in Illinois, called Morristown. So it was decided to call it Morrisville. Oh, that would never do. Isaac Morris was opposed to that. Morrisville sounds like a little village. How about just calling it Morris? And so, that is how the county seat was named. Well, outside of a few streets that are named after U.S. presidents and maybe a few schools, the bulk of the remaining places here in Grundy County that have been named after people are the names of early settlers and landowners. So we have names like Chapin Park, Claypool Road, Lutzo's Grove, Armstrong Street, and so on. Well, some of these people are more colorful than others, like Perry Armstrong. Now, county histories call him the father of Grundy County because he, along with Lawrence Claypool, were responsible for getting the petition signed and going to Springfield to agitate for the formation of Grundy County out of LaSalle County. Well, Perry Armstrong was an opportunist, and the little frontier town of Morris had lots of room for improvement. He opened the first grocery store. He conducted the first county business in his own home until the courthouse could be built, which he built himself and paid for himself. He built the first post office and served as the first postmaster. He served as justice of the peace, but he didn't like that job, so he ended up being elected as Morris supervisor. Then he went to Springfield again, and he helped draw the charter that would send the Chicago Rock Island Railroad through Morris. And while he was there, he landed a job in the auditor's office. Then when it came time to build the railroad through Morris, he was appointed assistant engineer. Then, in 1850, Congress passed an act authorizing the sale of undrained swampland. So Perry Armstrong brought this bill to the attention of Judge Hines, and he ended up in the real estate business. He sold off 13,000 acres of wet, soggy land, and he netted $25,000 for the Grundy County Treasury. In 1862, he served as delegate to the Illinois State Constitutional Convention. The next year, he was elected to the state legislature, and there he wrote several laws, including the jury law, the county court law, and he wrote some amendments to the criminal code and the road and bridge laws. So out of all this practical experience, you can bet that Perry Armstrong got a pretty good legal education. So he opened a law practice. In 1870, he served on the Morris School Board and was instrumental in getting Center School built. Well, isn't that just about enough to wear you out? Not Perry Armstrong. In his spare time, he studied Indian legends, culture, and lore, and he amassed quite a collection of artifacts. Many of them are still at the Grundy County Courthouse. You can go and see them. And he also wrote a book on the sock and the Black Caucus War. Here it is. It's quite a tome. Well, Perry Armstrong packed a lot into one lifetime. He was a man of great mental and physical strength, and he was a born leader. He was capable. He could see what needed to be done, and he did it, single-handedly if necessary. He had it all: energy, perseverance, and business tact. In fact, his influence was so great that the people in town referred to him as the Emperor. He was probably about the ablest man that Grundy County ever had. Well, there was a lot of work to be done in frontier Grundy County, and naming places was not a high priority. So we have a lot of places that were just transplants from places back home. So this place naming was done out of, I guess, nostalgia at best and homesickness at worst. We have Saratoga, which was named by Carpenter Conklin after Saratoga, New York, where he came from. And we have Ariana, named by Columbus Pinney, one of the first residents out there, after Erie County, New York. He probably came here by way of the Erie Canal, and so Lake Erie and that canal were parting memories on his trek to the unnamed territory of Grundy County. Well, there is one place in Grundy County that's named because it actually looks like the place, and that is Dresden. Now, this little early settlement, as you know, is perched up on a hill overlooking the Des Plaines and Kankakee rivers. Now, Dresden, Germany is also perched up on a hill overlooking the River Elbe. And Dresden, China is made from the clay deposits nearby. And Dresden's settlement also had rich clay deposits. The settlers called it boulder clay. Well, Dresden is located in Au-Sable Township, which is the oldest name on the land. It comes from the French, meaning by the sands. Au-Sable Creek was named by a couple of coureurs de bois, or French trappers, who were hunting beaver in the Big Creek around 1675. And as they scouted around the territory east of the creek, these French explorers no doubt came across a series of sand dunes. Now, these were left by the great wall of ice and water that flowed through the Minooka area in the wake of the Marseilles Glacier some 2 million years ago. That glacier left behind a beach of sand that can still be traced along Sand Ridge Road to the Au-Sable Creek. Now, the French explorers may have tramped across that beach and watched it stretch far off to the southeast. And maybe they stood at Sand Ridge near Quantum Chemical, and maybe they stooped to shake out some of that sandy glacial silt out of their moccasins, and they probably made a note in their book of their lucrative hunting ground as being by the sands, Au Sable. Finally, the early settlers named places after Indians. Now, the name Shabana, as you well know, appears on about every piece of land that saint has trod upon. We don't have any elm trees or parks named after him, but we do have a street, a school, and an antique fire engine. Well, the first settlers were captivated by Indian names because they used them quite a lot, even when they didn't like the Indian. To wit, Waponzi. Now, the name of Chief Waponzi was a person that Perry Armstrong, and he ought to know, he called him a giant in size and a devil by nature. His outstanding feature was that he had a completely bald head with a little scalp lock at the crown. He was quite reserved, except when he was drunk, and then he was a real savage. Waponsie first came to the attention of the white men during the Battle of Thames in 1813 when he was serving as a private. And during that battle, a musket ball went through his chest, but he survived, and so he took this as an omen from the Great Spirit to become a war chief, which he did. But still, he was a old heathen and a black-hearted murderer. And I'm going to let Lawrence Claypool tell you why, because he was there. This account is printed in the 1886 county history. And it says that James McKean, residing on north bank of the Kankakee River, along with a hired hand, John Byers, had been burning logs in the afternoon. Some Indians came along and asked the privilege of camping there for the night, which was readily granted. And in the evening they gathered, making a camp of about 50 and bringing a supply of whiskey. Soon Waponsie and his family joined them. His family consisted of one wife, of middle age, very attentive to his wants, helping him onto his pony, adjusting his pillow in the saddle. And then there was an old squaw, who was a wife evidently not in favor. There was a son of about 16 or 18 years old, a son-in-law and his wife, and 2 or 3 children, and 2 slave squaws, forlorn, miserable creatures in every respect. Now, after supper, McKean and Byers went out to the Indian camp to take a look, and they watched them in their drunken frolic. And as they approached them, they found a crowd of savages surrounding a log pile. And one of the slave squaws was lying on the ground, and Chief Waponsie was stooping over her and whispering to her in a low voice. And immediately after giving a signal, the other slave squaw came up and buried a hatchet into her brains. The body was just moved to a pile of logs, and this drunken party went on far into the night. In the morning, the Indians broke camp and went their way, and McKean and Byers were left to bury this unfortunate victim on the banks of the Kankakee. Well, so much for Waponsie's last act before he moved west of the Mississippi in 1837. Now, to be killed by a squaw is the most degrading act, the most degrading death that any Indian could have to suffer. So, Perry Armstrong had no use for Chief Waponsie. According to him, the name Waponsie should stand with that of Modoc Captain Jack and only be used in execration and scorn. So, how did one of our main streets get named after this one? Well, I think maybe somebody in the zoning office had Chief Waponsie confused with Chief Waubonsie. Now, if Chief Waubonsie was another friend of the whites, he, like Shabana, rode around on horseback warning the early settlers of impending Indian attacks. It's an easy mistake to make. You just tip that B down and you got a completely different Indian. So there's also a lesser Indian that we have on our land. He was a Potawatomi chief responsible for the name of Wopacan Creek. Now his claim to fame, according to the white settlers anyway, was that he signed the Treaty of Mississinewa in 1826 and endorsed the Treaty of Prairie du Chien in 1829. And of course, there went the Indian hunting grounds and began the long march to the reservations west of the Mississippi. Now the name Wopacan, or Wopaki, can be translated many different ways. It can be white nut, white earth, or white blanket, white something or other, maybe white like sugar, because another name for Wopacan Island is Sugar Island. But then there was another Potawatomi chief that was named Sugar that lived just up the creek a little bit near Sable. So as you see, the nature of Indian names makes them very hard to translate into something that means something to us. Take Manuka, for instance. Now this town was named by Dolly Ann Smith, the wife of Leander Smith, who was the mayor of that little town back in 1860. And she was part Potawatomi Indian, and she could speak the language. And apparently Mayor Smith put her in charge of naming all the streets in Manuka, because all the old streets anyway have Indian names. But why Manuka? Well, according to Elijah Haynes, who was an Indian authority back in the 1880s, the word Minoak means good earth. There's also a place called Manuka in Pennsylvania, and that place name is supposedly a corruption of the Delaware Indian words Minnow for good and Aki for land. And run together, that would be Minnewaukee, good land. But the Potawatomi word for good land is Minokeke. Haynes, he's the Indian scholar, remember, he believed the Grundy County place name was a transplant from Pennsylvania, because a lot of the early settlers in that area did come from Pennsylvania. But then he didn't know about Dolly Ann Smith. Well, I think that maybe the Delaware and the Potawatomi languages are from the same Algonquin language group, and so that's why these two words for good land are quite similar. And the possibilities go on. The name Manuka could also be derived from the Indian word Minokeke, which means maple forest. And that's not such an impossible possibility, because early postcards of the town shows us streets just lined with maple trees. But enough already. Manuka was a good land, and it was a favorite hunting ground of the Potawatomi Indians. And years later, the wife of the first mayor probably had visions of this being a prosperous little town. Manuka was a good land. And, just like Dolly Ann Smith, developers today rely on names that they're familiar with and ones that sound prosperous and appealing. And if you look at some of the street names on the subdivisions that are growing up around the area now, you'll see that they're named after members of the family, like Harmon Acres. We have the sons of Eloise and Carl memorialized in Brentwood Drive and Bruce Street. And some streets are given names that have commercial value because of their pleasant associations. So we've got Sunrise Circle, which faces north, not east, but that doesn't matter. And we have Riverview Court. I don't know where you see the river from, maybe if you stand on the roof. And of course, Hatcher's Woods fulfills that definition of a housing area as being a place where they cut down the trees and then name the streets after them. We've got Redbud Lane and Hickory Lane and so on. But most place names really do make perfect sense. Remember when the post office decided they had to put names on all the rural routes, they named most of the streets after the oldest settler or somebody that had lived there a long time. And so place names really do make sense, and it's fun to figure them out. And that, dearly beloved, is how Grundy County got its names.
Thank you, Debbie. That was real interesting. So when you go home, you think about that tonight, of all these towns, how they got named, and the streets. And she first started talking about areas named from people, like she said, Pioneer Road. That rang a bell. A lady is here tonight that lives on Pioneer Road, and she is a descendant of the Hope family. You want to stand up?
Oh, not really.
She
I'm
lives
married
on-
to a hog, actually, but
She lives on Pioneer Road.
I sure do. First settlement in Grundy County, right there in the first whole house, not the first house in Grundy County, of course, but the whole house there.
I couldn't
You're
help it.
making me blush.
Anybody else got something named after them? When they're talking about Oxbow, you know, I lived in Oxbow Township, and Mrs. Bowles there, she lives on, she knows about Dresden Hill. Yeah, we know about Dresden. But I didn't know all that had come from German area, a German name, and Dresden, China. I didn't know that. Yes, Mr.
Every
Brown.
two of us here lived in Stockdale.
Yeah,
And at one time it was called Sheepdale.
yeah.
And then I guess they decided to diversify, so they called it Stockdale. There was a post office there, a U.S. post office.
Things are going to change in that area maybe, huh? They're talking a lot of changes over that area. I noticed we got some guests here tonight. Welcome. I should have said that earlier. And if you're interested in ever becoming a member of the Historical Society, we invite you to join. So, I